The silence in the room was deafening. 23 of America's most elite warriors, men who had survived the brutal crucible of Navy SEAL training, sat frozen as a woman half their size systematically dismantled everything they thought they knew about combat. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, as she described techniques that could neutralize armed opponents in seconds. But it wasn't her words that silenced them, it was the demonstration that followed. Sarah Chen had just walked into the most testosterone-fueled training facility in the country and declared herself a Marine combat master. The SEALs had expected to witness either supreme arrogance or complete delusion. What they got instead was a lesson in humility that would haunt their careers forever. This isn't a story about gender politics or breaking barriers. This is about what happens when authentic skill meets skepticism, when years of brutal training clash with preconceived notions, and when respect is earned not through words, but through actions that speak louder than any boast ever could. The woman standing before these elite soldiers had survived things that would break most people. She had earned her stripes in places where mercy was a luxury and survival was an art form. But none of that mattered until she proved it. And prove it she did, in a way that left grown men questioning everything they thought they knew about strength, skill, and what it truly means to be a warrior. Sarah Chen stood 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed barely 130 pounds. To the casual observer walking past the Coronado Naval Base training facility that Tuesday morning, she looked like any other civilian contractor who might be delivering equipment or conducting administrative business. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore standard military-issued cargo pants and a plain gray t-shirt. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was about to turn the most elite training program in the United States military upside down. The invitation had come through unusual channels. Commander Jack Morrison, a 20-year veteran who had overseen countless SEAL training operations, had received a call from his old friend Colonel Rodriguez at Quantico. Rodriguez spoke of a Marine instructor who had been making waves in advanced combat training circles. Word was spreading quietly through military networks about techniques that were producing extraordinary results. Some called it revolutionary. Others called it impossible. Morrison was skeptical from the moment he heard the name Sarah Chen. Not because she was a woman, though that certainly raised eyebrows in a community where female combat instructors were still rare, but because the claims seemed too good to be true. According to Rodriguez, Chen had developed hand-to-hand combat methods that could neutralize armed opponents with minimal effort, techniques that worked regardless of size or strength differential. More importantly, she had a track record of teaching these methods to Marines who then went on to apply them successfully in real combat situations overseas. The SEAL community prided itself on having the most advanced combat training in the world. Their close-quarters combat program was legendary, refined through decades of real-world application and continuous improvement. The idea that a single Marine instructor could walk in and show them something new was both intriguing and insulting. Morrison had made the call anyway. Partly out of professional curiosity, partly because Rodriguez had never steered him wrong before, and partly because he knew his men could benefit from any legitimate tactical advantage. He had extended an invitation for Chen to visit Coronado and demonstrate her techniques to a select group of instructors and advanced trainees. That select group now consisted of 23 men, all of whom had completed SEAL training and most of whom had multiple combat deployments under their belts. They ranged in age from 25 to 42, with the younger ones eager to prove themselves and the older ones confident in their experience. What they all shared was a healthy dose of skepticism about what they were about to witness. Chief Petty Officer Mike Rodriguez, no relation to the colonel, was the unofficial leader of the group. At 34, he had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. He had trained in multiple martial arts disciplines and held instructor certifications in several combat systems. When Morrison had briefed the group about their visitor, Rodriguez had been the most vocal in his doubts. "I've heard these claims before," he had told the group the night before. "Some new system that's supposed to revolutionize everything. Usually turns out to be recycled techniques with fancy names and unrealistic demonstrations against compliant partners." The others had nodded in agreement. They had all seen demonstrations of various combat systems over the years. Some were legitimate improvements to existing techniques. Others were marketing disguised as innovation. All of them required careful evaluation before being considered for integration into their training programs. When Sarah Chen walked into the training facility at precisely 0800 hours, the conversation stopped. Not because of any dramatic entrance or commanding presence, but because she looked so utterly ordinary. The men had been expecting someone who would at least look like a formidable fighter. Instead, they saw someone who could have been anyone's sister or neighbor. Morrison made the introductions quickly and professionally. He outlined the purpose of the session and established the ground rules. This was an evaluation, not a sales pitch. Chen would have 2 hours to demonstrate her techniques and explain her methodology. The SEALs would ask questions, participate in demonstrations, and provide honest feedback. Everyone understood that the military's time was valuable and that extraordinary claims required extraordinary proof. Chen listened to the introduction without comment. When Morrison finished, she stepped forward and addressed the group in a voice that was clear but not particularly commanding. She thanked them for their time and acknowledged that she understood their skepticism. She had faced similar reactions before and knew that her appearance didn't inspire immediate confidence in her combat abilities. "What I'm going to show you today isn't magic," she began. "It's not a secret ancient technique or a revolutionary new fighting system. It's the application of basic principles of leverage, timing, and anatomy that most people overlook because they're focused on strength and speed." She paused and looked around the room, making eye contact with several of the men. "I know you've been told that size and strength don't matter in combat. That's not true. They matter a lot. What's also true is that they're not the only things that matter, and they're not always the most important things that matter." Petty Officer First Class Tommy Martinez raised his hand. At 6 feet 2 inches and 220 pounds, he was one of the larger men in the group. "With respect, ma'am, that sounds like something every martial arts instructor says right before they show you techniques that only work if your opponent cooperates." Chen smiled slightly. "You're absolutely right to be skeptical. The difference is that I'm not going to ask anyone to cooperate. In fact, I'm going to ask you to do the opposite." She gestured toward a large mat area in the center of the room. "I'd like to start with a simple demonstration. I need a volunteer who is going to try to prevent me from doing something very basic. Something so simple that there should be no way for me to succeed if what I'm claiming isn't true." Rodriguez stood up immediately. He had been planning to volunteer for whatever demonstration she had in mind. If he was going to evaluate her claims, he wanted to experience them firsthand. At 210 pounds and with extensive grappling experience, he was confident that he could provide an honest test of whatever she intended to show them. As they moved to the mat area, Chen explained what she wanted to do. "Chief Rodriguez is going to stand in a fighting stance of his choosing. His job is to prevent me from taking one step forward. That's it. One step. He can use any technique he wants, any amount of force he deems necessary. All I'm going to try to do is take a single step in his direction." The request seemed almost insulting to Rodriguez. He outweighed her by 80 pounds and had years of experience in preventing people from moving where they wanted to go. The idea that she could force her way past him was absurd. He took a standard fighting stance, balanced on the balls of his feet with his hands up in a defensive position. The other SEALs gathered around the mat area, watching with interest. A few were already mentally preparing their critiques of whatever demonstration was about to unfold. Chen stood about 6 feet away from Rodriguez, completely relaxed. She wasn't in any kind of fighting stance or ready position. She looked like someone waiting for a bus rather than someone about to engage in a physical confrontation. "Whenever you're ready, Chief," she said quietly. Rodriguez nodded and focused his attention on her center of mass, watching for any indication of movement or attack. He had been in this position countless times in training and combat. Reading an opponent's intentions and reacting appropriately was one of his core skills. What happened next took less than 3 seconds and left everyone in the room stunned. Chen took a small step to her left, not toward Rodriguez but at an angle that seemed to present no threat. Rodriguez shifted slightly to maintain his defensive position, tracking her movement. As his weight transferred to his right foot, Chen moved. The motion was so fluid and unexpected that Rodriguez later struggled to describe exactly what had happened. Chen seemed to flow toward him like water, her left hand making contact with his right wrist while her right hand touched his left elbow. There was no visible force, no dramatic technique, just a gentle redirection of his momentum that sent him stumbling backward 3 steps. Chen walked forward into the space he had vacated and stopped. She had taken her step, and Rodriguez had been completely unable to prevent it. The room was silent for a moment as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Rodriguez shook his head and returned to his starting position. "I wasn't ready," he said. "Let's try that again." Chen nodded and returned to her starting position. This time Rodriguez was fully focused and prepared. He had studied her movement and was confident he could counter whatever technique she had used. The result was identical. Rodriguez found himself stumbling backward while Chen calmly took her step forward. This time he had felt the technique more clearly, but that only made it more confusing. There had been no pain, no overwhelming force, just a momentary sensation of being off balance that had somehow resulted in complete loss of position. "One more time," Rodriguez said, his professional pride now fully engaged. He had never encountered a technique that could move him so easily with so little apparent effort. The third attempt produced the same result. Rodriguez was beginning to understand that whatever Chen was doing, it wasn't a trick or a demonstration designed for compliant partners. She was applying some principle of movement and leverage that he didn't understand, and it was working regardless of his preparation or intention to resist. Petty Officer Second Class James Wilson stepped forward. Wilson was the group's designated hand-to-hand combat expert and had trained extensively in multiple grappling arts. "Can I try?" he asked. For the next 20 minutes, every member of the group took turns trying to prevent Chen from taking a single step forward. Some tried to grab her. Others attempted to tackle her or use their superior reach to maintain distance. None of them succeeded. The technique she was using appeared simple, but its effectiveness was undeniable. More importantly, she was applying it against trained fighters who were actively trying to stop her and who had studied her previous demonstrations. This wasn't stage magic or cooperative demonstration. This was a reproducible technique that worked regardless of the opponent's size, strength, or level of resistance. After the last man had been gently but decisively moved aside, Chen returned to the front of the room. The atmosphere had changed completely. Where there had been polite skepticism, there was now intense interest. The SEALs were looking at her with the same attention they would give to a weapons system that might save their lives. "That was a very simple application of what I call displacement theory," Chen explained. "It's based on the fact that the human body maintains balance through a complex system of constant micro-adjustments. If you can interrupt those adjustments at the right moment and in the right way, you can control someone's movement regardless of their size or strength." She gestured to Rodriguez, who was still processing his inability to complete what should have been a simple task. "Chief Rodriguez is an excellent fighter with superior strength and experience. But he was focused on preventing forward movement while I was focused on controlling his balance. We weren't really engaged in the same contest." Martinez raised his hand again. "How do you identify the right moment? And how do you know which way to redirect someone?" "Those are excellent questions," Chen replied. "And they bring us to the heart of what I want to teach you today. The technique I just demonstrated is useful, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing is learning to read microsignals that the human body gives off before and during movement. Once you can do that, you can predict and control almost any physical action." She paused and looked around the room again. "But before we go further, I want to address something that some of you are probably thinking. You're wondering if this works against multiple opponents, against armed opponents, in confined spaces, when you're injured, or in any of the other challenging conditions you might face in real combat." Several of the men nodded. Those were exactly the questions they had been formulating. The answer is yes, with modifications based on the specific situation. But, more importantly, these principles work as force multipliers for the techniques you already know. They don't replace your existing skills. They enhance them. Chief Rodriguez stepped forward. His earlier skepticism had been replaced by professional curiosity. "Ma'am, with respect, we need to see more than just the step demonstration. We need to know if this works against real resistance in a real fight scenario." Chen smiled. "I was hoping someone would ask for that. Let's start with something more challenging." The training mat seemed smaller now that the stakes had been raised. Chief Rodriguez stood in the center, but this time he wasn't just trying to prevent Chen from taking a step. This time, he was armed with a rubber training knife and had been instructed to attack her with full intention to make contact. The other 22 SEALs formed a loose circle around the mat, their attention completely focused on what was about to unfold. "Standard knife attack scenario," Morrison announced from his position at the edge of the mat. "Chief Rodriguez will attempt to engage with lethal intent using appropriate training safety protocols. Ms. Chen will demonstrate defensive responses." Rodriguez held the training knife in a reverse grip, a position that allowed for quick, close-quarters attacks and made it difficult for an opponent to predict the direction of assault. He had used similar techniques in real combat situations and had trained countless hours against knife attacks. He was confident that regardless of Chen's technique with the balance displacement, an armed encounter would reveal the limitations of her system. Chen stood relaxed, about 8 feet from Rodriguez, with her hands at her sides. She was still wearing the same unremarkable gray t-shirt and cargo pants, still looking like someone who had wandered into the wrong building by mistake. The contrast between her casual appearance and the intensity of the situation was striking. "Chief, whenever you're ready," she said in the same calm voice she had used throughout the morning. Rodriguez began to circle to his right, looking for an opening. Chen turned to follow his movement but made no other adjustments to her position. She wasn't taking a defensive stance or preparing to react to his attack. She was simply watching him with an expression of mild interest. The attack came suddenly, and with the full force of Rodriguez's training and experience. He feinted left, then drove the training knife toward Chen's midsection in a strike that would have been lethal if delivered with a real blade. The movement was fast, precise, and executed with the kind of commitment that made it impossible to abort once initiated. Chen moved at the last possible moment, just as the knife was about to make contact. But, instead of the dramatic evasion or blocking technique the SEALs expected to see, she made a tiny adjustment that seemed almost insignificant. Her left hand touched Rodriguez's wrist while her right hand made contact with his shoulder. The knife passed by her body with less than an inch to spare, while Rodriguez found himself falling forward, completely off balance and unable to recover. As he stumbled past her, Chen's right hand moved to the back of his neck while her left maintained contact with his knife arm. With movements that appeared gentle but resulted in immediate compliance, she guided him face down onto the mat and controlled the weapon hand until the training knife clattered away across the floor. The entire encounter had taken less than 4 seconds. Rodriguez remained on the ground for a moment, processing what had happened. He had committed to a full-force attack with a weapon, using techniques that had served him well in real combat. Chen had neutralized the threat and controlled him without appearing to use any significant force or effort. "Son of a bitch," he said quietly as he got to his feet. Wilson stepped forward immediately. "My turn." His tone was respectful but determined. He had watched the knife demonstration carefully and thought he could identify the timing Chen had used to evade Rodriguez's attack. This time Chen suggested a variation. "Let's make it more realistic," she said. "Use whatever attack pattern you want, and don't tell me what you're planning. I want you to come at me the way you would engage an actual threat." Wilson nodded and picked up the training knife. He was a student of various fighting systems and had studied knife combat extensively. Unlike Rodriguez's single committed attack, Wilson planned to use a more complex pattern of feints, cuts, and thrusts that would be harder to predict and counter. The result was even more dramatic than the first demonstration. Wilson began with a series of probing attacks and feints, testing Chen's reactions and looking for openings. She responded by staying just out of range, moving minimally but always maintaining the perfect distance to avoid his attacks. When he committed to a serious thrust, she stepped inside his reach and used what appeared to be the same gentle contact technique to send him crashing to the mat. But, this time, instead of simply controlling him, she demonstrated what she called a termination option. With Wilson face down and his knife arm controlled, she showed how a slight adjustment in pressure and angle could result in joint dislocation or unconsciousness. In a real encounter, you would have multiple options at this point, she explained while maintaining control of Wilson's position. You could dislocate the shoulder, apply a blood choke, or strike vulnerable targets. The displacement technique creates opportunities for any of these responses. She released Wilson and helped him to his feet. The key is that once someone is off balance and falling, they can't defend themselves effectively. Their attention shifts from attack to trying to recover stability, and that gives you a significant advantage regardless of their size or skill level. Petty Officer First Class David Kim raised his hand. Kim was the smallest member of the group at 5 feet 8 inches and 170 pounds, but he was also one of the most technically skilled. "Ma'am, can you show us how to do what you just did? I mean, can you teach the actual technique?" Chen nodded. "That's why I'm here. But I need to warn you that this isn't something you'll master in a single session. The displacement technique requires you to develop sensitivity to balance and movement that most people never cultivate. It's not about memorizing a series of moves. It's about learning to read and respond to micro-signals." She gestured for Kim to join her on the mat. "We'll start with the most basic exercise. I want you to push against my hand with steady pressure while I try to identify the moment when your balance shifts." The next hour was unlike any training session the SEALs had ever experienced. Instead of learning specific techniques or memorizing combinations, they were being taught to develop sensitivity to minute changes in pressure, balance, and intention. Chen worked with each man individually, teaching them to feel the difference between committed movement and feints, between balanced and unbalanced positions, between relaxed and tense muscle states. The exercises seemed almost meditative compared to the high-intensity training they were accustomed to. But the practical applications became apparent quickly. Men who had been training partners for years began to experience each other's movements in completely new ways. They could suddenly predict attacks before they were launched and feel opportunities for counters that had previously been invisible. Martinez found himself able to unbalance opponents who significantly outweighed him. Wilson discovered that he could control knife attacks using minimal force and maximum timing. Rodriguez, still processing his earlier experiences, began to understand how Chen had been able to move him so effortlessly. "This is about intercepting intention," Chen explained as she worked with the group. "Most people react to the attack they can see. But every attack begins with a shift in balance, a change in pressure, or a micro-movement that happens before the visible technique. If you can respond to those early signals, you can control the outcome before your opponent even realizes the engagement has begun." The demonstration that followed made her point dramatically. Chen called for multiple attackers, something that would normally be extremely dangerous for a single defender. 3 of the largest SEALs approached her simultaneously, each armed with a training weapon and instructed to coordinate their attack for maximum effectiveness. What the observers witnessed defied their understanding of how multiple opponent encounters were supposed to unfold. Instead of the chaotic scramble they expected, Chen seemed to dance between the attackers, using their momentum and positioning against them. She would touch one attacker and send him stumbling into another, or redirect a weapon strike so that it interfered with a second attacker's movement. At no point did she appear to be fighting in the conventional sense. There were no punches, kicks, or aggressive movements. Instead, she flowed around and through the attacks, using minimal contact to create maximum disruption. Within 30 seconds, all 3 attackers were on the ground, their weapons scattered, while Chen stood calmly in the center of the mat. "Multiple opponents are actually easier than single opponents in some ways," she explained to the stunned audience. "They interfere with each other if you position them correctly. The key is using their aggression and momentum to create chaos in their ranks while maintaining your own stability and awareness." Senior Chief Petty Officer Robert Thompson, who had been observing silently, stepped forward. At 42, Thompson was the oldest and most experienced member of the group. He had seen decades of new training methods come and go, and he had developed a keen sense for distinguishing between legitimate innovations and flashy demonstrations. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "what we've seen here is impressive. But I have to ask about practical application. In a real combat situation, you're dealing with adrenaline, fear, limited visibility, confined spaces, and opponents who might be under the influence of drugs or motivated by fanaticism. How do these techniques adapt to those conditions? Chen nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right question, Senior Chief. And the answer is that the principles adapt better than most techniques because they're based on universal aspects of human physiology and physics. Balance and leverage work the same way regardless of whether someone is high on methamphetamine or fighting in a narrow hallway. She paused and looked around the room. But you're right that real combat introduces variables that training can't fully replicate. That's why I don't teach this as a complete fighting system. I teach it as an enhancement to the skills you already have. Thompson nodded but wasn't satisfied. Can you show us how it integrates with existing techniques? How it works when combined with conventional combat methods? Absolutely, Chen replied. Who here has been in actual close-quarters combat? Most of the men raised their hands. These were experienced operators who had been in situations where hand-to-hand combat wasn't theoretical but necessary for survival. Rodriguez, can you describe a specific encounter where you had to engage someone physically? Rodriguez considered for a moment. Afghanistan, 2018. We were clearing a compound and I ended up in a room with an insurgent who was armed with a knife. He was probably my size, maybe a little smaller, but he was committed to dying rather than being captured. How did it resolve? Chen asked. I used a disarm technique I learned in training, then subdued him with a chokehold. It worked, but it was messy and took longer than I would have liked. He managed to cut me twice before I could control the weapon. Chen nodded. With the techniques you've learned today, how might that encounter have gone differently? Rodriguez thought for a moment, then stepped onto the mat with one of the training knives. Wilson, can you play the role of the insurgent? Use the same kind of desperate, committed attack I faced. What followed was a revelation. Using the displacement principles Chen had taught, Rodriguez was able to intercept Wilson's attack before it fully developed. Instead of the extended struggle he had described from Afghanistan, the encounter was over in seconds with no injury to the defender and complete control of the threat. The difference, Chen explained, is that you responded to his intention to attack rather than to the attack itself. By the time you could see the knife moving, in your real encounter, he had already committed to the action and you had to react to something that was already in progress. Today, you felt his preparation to attack and responded before he could fully execute. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as the SEALs discussed what they were witnessing. Men who had been skeptical 2 hours earlier were now eagerly asking questions and requesting additional demonstrations. The transformation in atmosphere was complete. But Chen wasn't finished. There's one more aspect I want to show you before we break for lunch, she said. Everything we've done so far has been about responding to attacks. But these principles also work for initiating contact when you need to be the aggressor. She called for Martinez to return to the mat. This time, instead of defending against his attack, she would demonstrate how to overwhelm a skilled defender using displacement techniques. The demonstration was brief but decisive. Martinez, prepared for Chen's approach and ready to defend himself, found that his defensive techniques were ineffective against someone who could control his balance and positioning. Within seconds, he was on the ground despite his best efforts to maintain defensive positioning. This is what I call offensive displacement, Chen explained. Instead of waiting for an opportunity to counter, you create the opportunity by putting your opponent off balance first. Once they're focused on recovering stability, their ability to defend themselves is compromised. By the time Morrison called a break for lunch, the SEALs were convinced that they had witnessed something genuinely revolutionary. But, more than that, they had experienced it themselves. They had felt the techniques work against their own resistance and had begun to understand how the principles could be integrated into their existing skills. As they filed out of the training facility, their conversations were animated and focused. These were men accustomed to evaluating new techniques with professional skepticism, but what they had seen and felt that morning had passed every test they could devise. Chen remained behind to answer individual questions and provide additional clarification for those who wanted it. But she could see in their faces that the real learning was just beginning. They would spend the afternoon break processing what they had experienced and returning with even more challenging questions and scenarios. The woman who had walked into their facility that morning looking like a lost civilian contractor had proven herself to be exactly what she had claimed, a combat master whose techniques could enhance the capabilities of even the most elite warriors. The silence that had greeted her earlier declaration had been replaced by the kind of intense interest that indicated genuine respect. But the afternoon session would be even more demanding. Having demonstrated the basic principles, Chen would now have to show how they apply to the specific challenges these men faced in their operational environment. The real test was just beginning. The afternoon session began with a different energy. The morning's skepticism had been replaced by intense professional curiosity, but also by more challenging questions. These men had spent the lunch hour discussing what they had witnessed, and they had developed specific scenarios they wanted Chen to address. Senior Chief Thompson took the lead as they reconvened. "Ma'am, we've been talking, and we have some situations we'd like you to work through. These are based on actual encounters our people have faced overseas." Chen nodded and moved to the center of the training area. "I'm ready." First scenario, Thompson continued, consulting notes he had made during lunch. Room clearing operation. Narrow corridor, approximately 3 feet wide. Armed hostile at the end of the hallway with a rifle, positioned behind partial cover. Our operator needs to close distance and neutralize the threat without getting shot. It was a common tactical problem with no easy solutions. The confined space eliminated most evasive options, while the distance and the opponent's weapon advantage made direct assault extremely dangerous. Traditional approaches relied on suppressive fire from team members or specialized equipment to create opportunities for the point man. Chen studied the layout Thompson had described, then asked for the specifics to be replicated in the training area. Using movable walls and obstacles, they created a narrow corridor approximately 15 feet long with cover positions at the far end. Wilson took position behind the mock cover with a training rifle, while Chen prepared to demonstrate an approach. "Before I start," she said, "I want to explain the principle we'll be using. In a confined space, the defender's advantages are range and position. But they also have a significant disadvantage: limited mobility. If I can force movement, I can eliminate both of their advantages simultaneously." She began her approach from the corridor entrance, moving in a way that seemed completely inappropriate for the tactical situation. Instead of hugging one wall or moving in a low, defensive posture, she walked down the center of the corridor at a normal pace, completely exposed to Wilson's simulated rifle. The SEALs watching from the sides expected to see Wilson easily track and engage this obviously vulnerable target. Instead, what they witnessed was something far more sophisticated. As Chen moved down the corridor, her path was not linear. She made tiny lateral adjustments, subtle changes in pace, and minimal shifts in posture that seemed insignificant to the observers. But, from Wilson's perspective behind the simulated rifle, these micro-movements made it nearly impossible to establish a clear sight picture. "She's creating uncertainty in the target zone," Martinez observed quietly. "He can't predict exactly where she'll be when he needs to fire." By the time Chen reached the halfway point of the corridor, Wilson was experiencing something he had never encountered in similar training scenarios. Despite having a clear field of fire and plenty of time to engage, he found himself unable to establish the precise aim point necessary for an effective shot. Every time he thought he had her centered in his sights, she would make a tiny adjustment that threw off his calculation. When she reached the three-quarter point, Chen accelerated suddenly. But, instead of charging straight at Wilson's position, she moved at an angle that took her briefly out of his direct line of sight behind his cover. In the fraction of a second it took him to adjust his position to reacquire her, she had closed the remaining distance and was controlling his weapon. The entire approach had taken less than 8 seconds. Wilson found himself disarmed and controlled without having had a clear opportunity to engage the target. "How did you do that?" he asked as Chen released her control and helped him recover his position. "Timing and movement prediction," she replied. "You were trying to track a target that was moving in ways that violated your expectations. Your brain was constantly trying to calculate where I would be next, but I was feeding it inconsistent information. She gestured for the group to gather closer. The key is understanding how human visual tracking works. When someone is aiming a weapon, they're not just looking at where you are now. They're predicting where you'll be when they pull the trigger. If you can disrupt that prediction process, you can get very close to someone even when they have a significant range advantage. Thompson nodded approvingly. That's a technique we can actually use. But, what about the next scenario? He consulted his notes again. Hostage situation. Armed subject holding a knife to a civilian's throat. Our operator needs to neutralize the threat without injury to the hostage. This was an even more challenging scenario, one that had no margin for error. A single mistake could result in the death of an innocent person. Traditional approaches relied on precision shooting by trained snipers or complex distractions that created brief opportunities for rescue teams. Chen considered the scenario, then asked for it to be set up with appropriate safety protocols. Rodriguez volunteered to play the role of the hostile, using a training knife and working with specific guidelines to ensure no one was actually injured during the demonstration. Kim volunteered to play the hostage role, understanding that the scenario would require him to follow specific positioning and movement instructions to maintain safety while creating realistic challenges for the demonstration. This scenario requires perfect timing and precise application of force, Chen explained as the setup was completed. There's no room for the kind of general displacement techniques we used earlier. Everything has to be calculated and executed exactly right. She positioned herself about 6 feet from Rodriguez and Kim, studying the setup carefully. Rodriguez held the training knife against Kim's throat while maintaining a defensive position that gave him clear sightlines to identify any approaching threat. The principle here is still about reading microsignals, Chen said. But, instead of looking for balance shifts, I'm looking for attention shifts. The hostage taker has to divide his attention between controlling the hostage and watching for threats. That divided attention creates opportunities. She began her approach slowly, moving in a way that kept Rodriguez's attention focused on her while carefully monitoring his grip on Kim and the position of the training knife. As she got closer, she began making small movements and gestures that drew Rodriguez's visual focus without seeming threatening. What happened next was almost too quick to follow. In a single fluid motion, Chen stepped forward and made contact with both Rodriguez's knife hand and his supporting arm. The movement was so precisely timed and executed that Rodriguez found the weapon controlled and himself off balance before he could react. Kim was able to step away safely while Chen maintained control of the threat. The key was waiting for the moment when his attention was focused on my movement rather than on maintaining weapon control, she explained after releasing Rodriguez. There's always a brief instant when the hostage taker's concentration shifts. That's your window. The demonstration had been flawless, but several of the SEALs had questions about the practical application under real-world conditions. Ma'am, Martinez asked, that technique requires you to get very close to an armed subject who's alert and expecting trouble. How do you create the opportunity to make that approach? Excellent question, Chen replied. In most real situations, you wouldn't make that approach alone. You'd coordinate with other team members to create distractions or to position multiple threats that divide the subject's attention. The technique I showed you is just the final phase of a larger tactical plan. She spent the next 20 minutes working through variations of the hostage scenario, showing how the displacement principles could be adapted to different positions, different weapons, and different environmental factors. Each variation built on the others, creating a comprehensive approach to one of the most challenging situations operators might face. But Thompson had saved the most difficult scenario for last. Final scenario, he announced. Multiple armed hostiles in a confined space. Unknown number of civilians present. Our operator is alone and cannot withdraw. He needs to neutralize the threats while protecting non-combatants. This was the nightmare scenario that kept tactical commanders awake at night. Multiple armed opponents, civilian lives at stake, no backup available, and no clear escape route. It was the kind of situation where even the most skilled operators might not survive, let alone succeed. Chen listened to the scenario description without changing expression. When Thompson finished, she was quiet for several moments, clearly thinking through the implications and challenges involved. This is where the displacement principles become force multipliers rather than primary techniques, she finally said. You can't fight multiple armed opponents simultaneously using any hand-to-hand system. But you can use positioning and timing to turn it into a series of single-opponent encounters. She asked for the scenario to be set up with 4 volunteers playing hostile roles and 2 others representing civilians. The mock environment represented a small room with limited cover and multiple sightlines that the hostiles could use to coordinate their fire. The key is controlling the sequence of engagement, Chen explained as she studied the setup. I need to position myself so that I can engage the threats one at a time while using their positions and the terrain to prevent them from supporting each other effectively. What followed was the most complex demonstration of the day. Chen moved through the mock environment in a pattern that seemed almost choreographed, but which resulted in each hostile being isolated and neutralized before the others could provide effective support. She used displacement techniques to quickly control each opponent while using their positions and the environmental features to block the sightlines of the others. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 minutes, but it demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that impressed even these experienced operators. Chen had not only neutralized 4 armed opponents in a confined space, but she had done so while ensuring the safety of the civilian role-players. How much of that was planned versus reactive? Rodriguez asked after the demonstration concluded. About 50-50, Chen replied. I had a general strategy for controlling the sequence of engagement, but the specific techniques I used against each opponent were based on reading their individual responses and adapting accordingly. She paused and looked around the room. That's really the heart of what I've been trying to teach you today. These aren't techniques you memorize and apply mechanically. They're principles you internalize and, then, adapt to whatever situation you encounter. Wilson raised his hand. Ma'am, what's the learning curve for developing this level of skill? How long does it take to become proficient enough to use these techniques operationally? That depends on several factors, Chen replied. Your existing skill level, how much time you can dedicate to training, and, most importantly, whether you have qualified instructors available for ongoing development. She gestured toward Morrison. That's actually what brought me here today. The Marine Corps has been developing an instructor certification program for these techniques. We're looking to identify operators who can not only learn the system but also teach it to others. Morrison stepped forward. What MS? Chen is saying is that we're looking for volunteers for an advanced training program. 3 months at Quantico, intensive instruction in both the techniques themselves and the methodology for teaching them to others. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Every SEAL in the room volunteered for the program on the spot. Thompson spoke for the group. Ma'am, what we've seen here today is going to change how we think about close-quarters combat. We need to learn this system and we need to bring it back to our teams. Chen smiled. That was the goal, Senior Chief. These techniques were developed specifically for Special Operations Forces. They're designed to enhance the capabilities of people who are already highly skilled and operating in extremely challenging environments. She looked around the room one final time. But I want to emphasize something important. What you've learned today is just the foundation. The real development happens through consistent practice and real-world application. These principles will continue to evolve as you use them and as you encounter new situations that test their limits. As the formal session concluded, the SEALs gathered around Chen with individual questions and requests for additional demonstrations. The transformation in their attitude was complete. The woman who had been greeted with polite skepticism that morning was now being treated as a valued instructor whose techniques could save lives and enhance mission effectiveness. But, more than that, they had experienced something that challenged their fundamental assumptions about combat and human performance. They had seen that size and strength, while important, were not the only factors that determined the outcome of physical encounters. They had learned that awareness and timing could be just as effective as speed and power. The silence that had greeted Chen's initial declaration had been replaced by animated discussions about training schedules, instructor certifications, and operational applications. The SEALs were already planning how to integrate these new capabilities into their existing skill sets and how to share them with their teammates. As they prepared to leave the training facility, each man knew that their understanding of combat had been fundamentally changed. They had witnessed the emergence of a new paradigm in close-quarters fighting, one that would influence their careers and potentially save their lives in future operations. The afternoon session had proven that Chen's techniques were not just impressive demonstrations but practical tools that could be adapted to the specific challenges faced by special operations forces. The real test would come when these men returned to their units and began applying what they had learned in actual operational environments. But, that afternoon, watching Chen pack her simple training gear and prepare to leave, they knew they had experienced something extraordinary. The Marine Combat Master had delivered exactly what she had promised, a new understanding of what was possible in close-quarters combat, and the tools to achieve it. 3 months later, Senior Chief Thompson sat in the debriefing room at Quantico, surrounded by the most comprehensive collection of after-action reports he had ever seen. The advanced combat training program that had emerged from Chen's demonstration at Coronado was producing results that exceeded everyone's expectations. But, as he reviewed the documentation, Thompson realized that none of them had really understood who Sarah Chen was or how she had developed the techniques that were now revolutionizing close-quarters combat training across multiple branches of the military. The revelation had come during a conversation with Colonel Rodriguez, the Marine who had originally recommended Chen to Commander Morrison. Thompson had been at Quantico for 2 weeks as part of the instructor certification program when he had finally asked the question that had been bothering him since that first demonstration. "Sir, where did Chen learn to fight like that? I mean, who trained her?" Rodriguez had looked up from the training reports he was reviewing and smiled grimly. "Thompson, you never asked about her background before volunteering for this program?" "No, sir. I figured if she could do what we saw her do, her background was secondary to the results." "Well," Rodriguez said, setting down his papers, "her story is why these techniques work so well in real combat situations. Sarah Chen didn't develop this system in a martial arts school or a military training facility. She developed it in places where failure meant death." The story that Rodriguez told over the next hour explained everything Thompson had witnessed and more. Sarah Chen had joined the Marines at 18, driven by a combination of patriotic duty and the need to escape a family situation that had become impossible. Her father had been an abusive alcoholic who had made life at home dangerous for both Chen and her younger sister. The military had offered both escape and purpose. But Chen's path through the Marines had been anything but conventional. Her small size and quiet demeanor had initially led instructors to assume she would be best suited for support roles rather than combat positions. That assumption had nearly cost her life during her first deployment to Afghanistan in 2015. Chen had been assigned to a logistics convoy that was ambushed outside Kandahar. When the shooting started, she had followed her training and taken a defensive position behind their disabled vehicle. But, when insurgents had overrun their position and begun executing wounded Marines, Chen had made a decision that changed the course of her entire military career. Using only a combat knife and what she later described as desperate innovation, Chen had killed 3 armed insurgents who were systematically murdering her fellow Marines. The techniques she used bore no resemblance to anything she had been taught in training. Instead, they were improvised responses based on her intuitive understanding of leverage, timing, and human anatomy. The incident had saved the lives of 5 Marines, including her convoy commander, who later recommended Chen for both a Bronze Star and immediate transfer to force reconnaissance training. But the psychological impact on Chen was profound. She had discovered that survival in real combat required skills that went far beyond what traditional military training provided. During her recovery from injuries sustained in the ambush, Chen had begun systematically analyzing what had happened during those crucial minutes when she had fought for her life and the lives of her fellow Marines. She broke down every movement, every decision, and every technique she had used, trying to understand why her improvised methods had been so effective against larger, more experienced opponents. She spent 2 years developing what she calls her survival methodology, Rodriguez explained to Thompson. But it wasn't just theoretical analysis. She was testing and refining these techniques in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. Chen's subsequent military career had been marked by a series of deployments to increasingly challenging environments. She had served with force reconnaissance units in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, always volunteering for the most dangerous missions and always coming back with after-action reports that described successful engagements using techniques that weren't found in any manual. But her real development as a combat instructor had begun after a mission in eastern Syria in 2018. Chen's unit had been ambushed by a larger force of ISIS fighters in a compound that offered no escape route. During the 6-hour firefight that followed, Chen had been forced to engage in hand-to-hand combat with multiple opponents while wounded and operating in near-complete darkness. She had not only survived but had been responsible for neutralizing 7 enemy fighters using close-quarters techniques that enabled her team to break out of the ambush and reach their extraction point. The mission had been classified at the highest levels, but word of Chen's performance had reached senior leadership throughout the special operations community. That's when they pulled her from field operations and assigned her to develop training programs, Rodriguez continued. But Chen insisted on doing something that no one had ever attempted before. She wanted to test her techniques against America's most elite fighters before teaching them to anyone else. What followed was an 18-month period during which Chen had systematically challenged and trained with the best close-quarters combat instructors in every branch of the military. She had worked with Delta Force operators, Navy SEALs, Marine Raiders, and Army Rangers, not as a student but as a peer who was developing and refining a new combat system. Each training session had been more challenging than the last. Chen would arrive at a new facility with nothing but her techniques and her willingness to test them against the most skilled fighters the military could produce. She lost some of those early encounters, but she learned from every defeat and continuously refined her approach based on what she discovered. The breakthrough came when she realized that she wasn't developing a fighting system, Rodriguez explained. She was developing a teaching methodology that could help other people discover their own optimal responses to combat situations. Instead of creating a rigid set of techniques that students would memorize and apply mechanically, Chen had developed a training approach that taught principles of awareness, timing, and adaptation that could be applied to any combat situation. Her students learned to read situations and respond appropriately rather than simply following predetermined patterns. The results had been extraordinary. Marines who trained in Chen's system began reporting successful close-quarters engagements in real combat situations. More importantly, they were suffering fewer casualties and completing missions that had previously been considered extremely high-risk. Word of these results had reached the highest levels of military leadership, leading to the request for Chen to demonstrate her techniques to other elite units. The session at Coronado had been just one of many such demonstrations, but it had been particularly significant because of the SEAL community's reputation for skepticism about new training methods. Chen chose to work with your unit, Rodriguez told Thompson, because she knew that if she could convince Navy SEALs that her techniques were legitimate, she could convince anyone. Thompson nodded, finally, understanding why Chen had seemed so prepared for their skepticism and so confident in her ability to overcome it. She hadn't just been demonstrating techniques, she had been completing a validation process that had taken years to develop. But Rodriguez wasn't finished with Chen's story. What you saw at Coronado was actually the culmination of her development process, not the beginning. Chen has been refining these techniques through real-world application for almost 8 years. Every technique she showed you has been tested in actual combat situations. Thompson thought back to that first demonstration, when Chen had so easily displaced Rodriguez despite his size and experience advantage. At the time, it had seemed almost magical. Now he understood that it was the result of years of development, testing, and refinement in environments where failure was not an option. "Sir, why didn't you tell us this background before the demonstration?" Thompson asked. Rodriguez smiled. "Because it wouldn't have mattered. You had to experience the techniques yourself before you could appreciate the story behind them. If I had told you that Chen was a decorated combat veteran who had developed her system through real-world encounters, you would have been impressed. But you still would have been skeptical about whether her techniques would work for you." Thompson realized that Rodriguez was absolutely right. The Marine's background was fascinating and certainly explained her credibility, but it was the direct experience of her techniques that had convinced the SEALs of their value. Learning her story afterward simply provided context for something they had already accepted based on practical demonstration. Now, Rodriguez continued, I want to show you something that will help you understand why this training program is so important. He pulled out a thick folder containing classified after-action reports from recent special operations missions. As Thompson read through the documents, he saw report after report describing successful close-quarters engagements by Marines who had been trained in Chen's techniques. The results were consistently impressive. Marines were successfully engaging multiple opponents, neutralizing armed threats in confined spaces, and completing missions with significantly reduced casualties. More importantly, they were reporting increased confidence in their ability to handle unexpected combat situations. These results aren't just statistical improvements, Rodriguez explained. They represent a fundamental change in how our people approach close-quarters combat. Chen's techniques give them tools they can adapt to any situation rather than a fixed set of responses they apply mechanically. Thompson continued reading, becoming more impressed with each report. The techniques he had learned at Coronado were being applied successfully in real-world situations across multiple theaters of operation. Marines were using displacement principles to control hostage situations, neutralize armed threats in urban environments, and succeed in scenarios where traditional approaches had proven inadequate. But, what impressed Thompson most was the consistency of the results. Regardless of the specific situation or the individual Marine applying the techniques, the outcomes were uniformly positive. This suggested that Chen had developed not just effective techniques but an effective teaching methodology that could reliably transfer skills to students with varying backgrounds and abilities. Sir, how many people are currently trained in these techniques? Thompson asked. About 300 Marines across all specialties, Rodriguez replied. But that's going to change rapidly. Based on these results, leadership has authorized expansion of the program to include all combat specialties and selected personnel from other branches. Thompson understood the implications. If the program expanded as Rodriguez was suggesting, Chen's techniques would become standard training for thousands of military personnel. The woman who had walked into their facility at Coronado with such modest appearance and quiet confidence was revolutionizing how the American military approached close-quarters combat. Which brings us to why you're here, Rodriguez continued. We need qualified instructors who can teach these techniques to others. Not just demonstrate them, but actually transfer the underlying principles so that students can adapt and apply them independently. The instructor certification program Thompson was attending was designed to identify and train personnel who could become certified teachers of Chen's system. It was more demanding than any training program Thompson had experienced, requiring not just mastery of the techniques but also deep understanding of the teaching methodology that made them effective. Chen personally evaluates every instructor candidate, Rodriguez explained. She won't certify anyone who can't demonstrate both technical proficiency and teaching ability under realistic conditions. Thompson had already been through 2 weeks of the most intensive training of his military career. Every day brought new challenges and new requirements to prove that he could not only apply Chen's techniques but also teach them to others. The standards were extraordinarily high, but the results justified the investment. As Thompson prepared to leave the debriefing room and return to his training, he reflected on how much his understanding had evolved since that first day at Coronado. What had seemed like an impressive but mysterious demonstration had revealed itself to be the product of years of development and real-world testing by one of the most capable warriors he had ever encountered. Sarah Chen's story was remarkable not just because of her personal achievements, but because of her commitment to sharing her knowledge with others. She had taken techniques developed through necessity and survival and transformed them into a systematic approach that could enhance the capabilities of any warrior willing to learn. The silence that had greeted her declaration at Coronado now seemed almost comical to Thompson. None of them had understood that they were meeting someone who had literally fought her way to mastery, testing and refining her skills in the most demanding environment possible, actual combat where lives depended on her abilities. As he returned to his training, Thompson carried with him a new appreciation for both the techniques he was learning and the woman who had developed them. Sarah Chen had earned her title as a combat master through years of dedication, sacrifice, and constant improvement. Now she was ensuring that others could benefit from everything she had learned along the way. 2 years after that initial demonstration at Coronado, the impact of Sarah Chen's techniques had spread far beyond what anyone had originally envisioned. Senior Chief Thompson, now a certified instructor himself, stood before a joint training session that included personnel from all branches of the military, several allied nations, and even selected law enforcement agencies. What had begun as a single demonstration to a skeptical group of Navy SEALs had evolved into a fundamental shift in how modern warriors approached close-quarters combat. The numbers told part of the story. Over 3,000 military personnel had now been trained in Chen's displacement techniques, with instructors' certification programs operating at facilities across the United States and at several overseas locations. The after-action reports continued to document impressive results, with trained personnel reporting successful engagements in increasingly challenging real-world situations. But the numbers didn't capture the full scope of what had changed. The techniques themselves were just one aspect of a broader transformation in how military personnel thought about combat, adaptation, and continuous learning. Thompson had seen this transformation firsthand during his 18 months as an instructor. Students arrived at his courses with varying levels of skepticism, but they all left with a fundamentally different understanding of their own capabilities. The displacement principles didn't just teach them new techniques, they taught them new ways of perceiving and responding to threats. The most important thing Chen gave us, Thompson often told new instructor candidates, wasn't a set of fighting techniques. It was a methodology for continuous adaptation and improvement. She showed us how to learn from every encounter and how to apply those lessons to new situations. This adaptability had proven crucial as trained personnel encountered situations that went beyond the scenarios covered in formal training. Marines in urban combat environments had adapted the displacement principles to work in confined spaces with multiple obstacles. Navy personnel had modified the techniques for shipboard operations where falls could be lethal. Army Rangers had integrated them into room-clearing procedures that reduced casualties while increasing mission success rates. Each adaptation fed back into the training program, creating a continuous cycle of improvement and refinement. Chen had established a system for collecting and analyzing field reports that ensured lessons learned in real combat were incorporated into future training as quickly as possible. But perhaps the most significant impact had been on the culture of military training itself. Chen's emphasis on understanding principles rather than memorizing techniques had influenced how other subjects were being taught. Instructors across the military were beginning to adopt similar approaches, focusing on developing students' ability to think and adapt rather than simply follow predetermined procedures. The law enforcement applications had been particularly noteworthy. Police departments that had incorporated Chen's techniques into their training programs were reporting dramatic reductions in officer injuries during arrests and confrontations. More importantly, they were seeing decreased use of lethal force as officers became more confident in their ability to control situations through precise application of displacement techniques. Detective Maria Santos of the Los Angeles Police Department had been one of the first law enforcement officers to complete the instructor's certification program. Her experience illustrated how Chen's techniques were adapting to civilian applications while maintaining their effectiveness. Before this training, Santos explained to a group of fellow officers, we relied heavily on overwhelming force and backup to control dangerous suspects. Now we have tools that allow us to neutralize threats while minimizing injury to everyone involved, including the suspect. Santos had used Chen's techniques successfully in multiple high-risk arrests, including a situation involving an armed subject who was threatening civilians in a crowded shopping mall. Using displacement principles, she had been able to approach and neutralize the threat without firing a shot and without injury to anyone involved. The key was reading his micro-movements and understanding how his attention was divided, Santos later explained in her report. I could see when he was focused on the crowd versus when he was watching for police response. That gave me the timing I needed to move in and control his weapon. Similar reports were coming from police departments across the country. Officers trained in Chen's techniques were successfully resolving situations that might previously have required lethal force or resulted in officer injuries. The techniques were proving equally effective against subjects under the influence of drugs or alcohol, situations where traditional control methods often failed. International interest had also grown significantly. Military personnel from allied nations were participating in training programs, and several countries had requested assistance in establishing their own instructor certification programs. The techniques were being adapted to work within different military traditions and operational requirements, but the core principles remained consistent. British Special Air Service personnel had been among the first international students, and their feedback had been particularly valuable. Captain James Morrison of the SAS had completed the full instructor certification and returned to the United Kingdom to establish a training program for British Special Operations Forces. The displacement techniques integrate perfectly with our existing training, Morrison reported. But, more importantly, they've changed how our people think about problem solving in combat situations. We're seeing improved performance across all aspects of close quarters operations, not just in hand-to-hand encounters. The success stories were accumulating, but Chen herself remained focused on continued development and refinement. She had established a research program that was exploring applications of displacement principles to other areas of military and civilian life. Teams were investigating how the same concepts that worked in physical combat might apply to tactical decision-making, team coordination, and stress management. Dr. Michael Chang, a research psychologist working with Chen's development team, was studying the cognitive aspects of the displacement methodology. His preliminary findings suggested that the training was improving students' ability to process information under stress and make effective decisions in rapidly changing situations. The techniques require students to develop heightened awareness of their environment and the people in it, Chang explained. But that awareness seems to transfer to other situations beyond physical combat. We're seeing improved performance in complex decision-making tasks and better stress management across the board. This broader impact was attracting attention from organizations outside the military and law enforcement communities. Corporate training programs were beginning to incorporate modified versions of Chen's awareness and adaptation principles to help executives and managers perform better under pressure. Emergency medical personnel were learning to apply displacement concepts to manage agitated patients and work more effectively in chaotic environments. But Chen was careful to ensure that the core military applications remained the primary focus. She had seen too many effective training programs become diluted as they expanded into civilian markets, losing their practical edge in the process. The techniques work because they're based on real-world necessity, she explained to a gathering of military instructors. As soon as we start compromising on standards or adapting them for applications where failure doesn't have serious consequences, we risk losing what makes them effective. To maintain standards, Chen had established a rigorous certification process for all instructors and a continuous monitoring system for training programs. Only personnel who could demonstrate both technical proficiency and teaching ability under realistic conditions were authorized to teach others. Programs that didn't maintain standards lost their certification and authorization to use Chen's training materials. The result was a network of highly qualified instructors who were consistently producing students capable of applying displacement techniques successfully in real-world situations. The quality control measures had prevented the degradation that often occurred when successful training programs expanded rapidly. As Thompson reflected on the transformation he had witnessed, he was struck by how much had changed since that first day at Coronado. The woman who had faced their skepticism with quiet confidence had revolutionized not just their fighting techniques, but their entire approach to learning and adaptation. The SEALs who had originally challenged Chen's techniques were now among her most effective advocates and instructors. Rodriguez had become the lead instructor for the East Coast Certification Program. Wilson was running advanced courses for special operations personnel. Martinez had developed specialized applications for urban combat environments. Each of them carried forward not just the techniques they had learned, but the broader lesson Chen had taught them, that expertise required continuous learning, adaptation, and willingness to challenge existing assumptions. They had learned that mastery wasn't about perfecting a fixed set of skills, but about developing the ability to respond effectively to any situation they might encounter. The silence that had greeted Chen's initial declaration at Coronado had long since been replaced by a different kind of quiet, the focused attention of students who understood they were learning from someone who had earned her knowledge through years of dedication and real-world application. That attention was now being replicated in training facilities around the world as more warriors discovered the power of displacement techniques. But, perhaps the most important legacy of that day at Coronado wasn't the techniques themselves or even their widespread adoption. It was the demonstration that innovation in military training came not from theory or tradition, but from individuals willing to challenge conventional wisdom and prove their ideas through practical application. Sarah Chen had walked into a room full of America's most elite warriors and declared herself a combat master. The silence that followed had been the sound of preconceptions being challenged. What came after that silence was the sound of minds opening to new possibilities and new ways of thinking about human potential. The techniques that silenced those seals in seconds had gone on to enhance the capabilities of thousands of warriors around the world. But, more than that, they had proven that innovation and excellence could come from unexpected sources and that the most profound improvements often came from questioning the most basic assumptions about what was possible. As Thompson prepared for another day of training future instructors, he carried with him the knowledge that he was part of something larger than a training program. He was part of a transformation in how warriors thought about their craft and their ability to continue growing and improving throughout their careers. The woman who had seemed so ordinary that morning in Coronado had proven to be anything but ordinary. Sarah Chen had demonstrated that true mastery wasn't about impressive displays of strength or speed, but about understanding principles so deeply that they could be applied to any situation and shared with others who were committed to excellence. The silence she had created that day continued to echo in training facilities around the world, as new students discovered that their understanding of what was possible was about to be fundamentally changed. And, in that ongoing silence, the sound of learning and growth continued to spread, one warrior at a time.